Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and we're so happy to have you with us today for this Zoomversation. I'm really hoping that that term catches on. I'm doing my very best, putting it on Twitter as often as possible. Today's conversation, as you know, is about something so dear to me, and I know to all of you, which is journalism, particularly Jewish journalism, and how we are faring in this coronavirus crisis, but also the ongoing crisis facing the journalism, news industry, as what's happened in this pandemic has so quickly and harshly intensified some of the challenges that local news organizations, community news organizations like ours, like the J, and like the Canadian Jewish News, which tragically closed right before Passover, were facing before and are facing in a more intensified way. These challenges intensifying, the disappearance of local advertising, the challenges and expense of printing, are intensifying and turning into crises, just as we and journalists across the country, across the world, are doing some of our best and most important work to cover this pandemic and its impact on the Jewish community and on local individual communities. And we have seen at The Forward, we have seen across the news industry, record engagement and interest from readers in our coverage of the coronavirus and how it's affecting our community institutions, how it's affecting individual lives. And yet, even as that's happening, we have news all across the country and world about layoffs, furloughs, cutbacks, and even closures of news organizations. I'm thrilled to have this amazing panel with me today. I have my colleague Sue Fishkoff, who's a longtime editor of the J, the Northern California Jewish News Organization. We have Professor Jonathan Sarna from Brandeis, who is the preeminent historian of American Jewish communities and has a particular fondness and kind of appreciation of the role that Jewish journalism has played in our history, and wrote an incredibly strong and important op-ed off of the news a couple of weeks ago that the Canadian Jewish News was closing, and that the Jewish Chronicle of Britain, which is the world's oldest news organization, was in trouble anew. And we'll get back to the news about that. I also have, although he's stepped away from his desk for a second, Ben Smith, the media equation columnist for the New York Times. There he is, there's Ben on the phone, reporting as always. We've given him permission to multitask because he's probably breaking some important story, but I'm sure you know Ben's name. He, as I said, is the new media columnist at the New York Times, where I worked for more than 20 years. He also was the founding editor of BuzzFeed News, and really knows more about the challenges and successes of digital journalism than anyone in the country. And my kind of co-host for today is Andres Spokoiny of the Jewish Funders Network, who is, as I said, co-sponsoring this panel with us, and who is, I think you'll hear, has such an appreciation for the way that journalism, Jewish journalism, the role it plays in our democracy and in our communities. And I just am so appreciative of his appreciation of the work that we do. I'm going to filibuster for just one more second as people continue to join us, to just talk a bit about what The Forward's been doing these last, I guess we're in like week 6 of sheltering in place, week 5. Different people in different parts of the country are probably in different places. But we at The Forward have really been trying to lean into our role as a community convener, as well as a kind of news driver. So we have been holding some weekly or bi-weekly seminars like this, where we talk to Jewish thought leaders about the important issues of the day. We've also reopened our Scribe platform, on which we're publishing dozens of kind of personal essays of people experiencing the crisis. And we've been also aggressively covering the news, particularly as it affects the Orthodox communities in the New York area and around the country. We've also been able to, during this time, launch our national expansion. We announced the hiring of Rob Eshman, the former editor of the Los Angeles Jewish Journal. He is leading our national expansion and coverage in a variety of areas: Boston, Chicago, South Florida, and California in particular. But really, we've also been able to publish under his leadership a lot of more international content. So we're very excited about that. And we're thrilled to have all of you on this call. Just a couple of programming notes. I see some of you are already using the chat to communicate us, which is great. As Lisa Lepson, our Vice President of Development who organized this seminar, has already posted in the chat, the best way to ask a question is to use the Q&A button, which is also either on the bottom or on the left of your screen. They last longer there. And if you want to talk to the whole community of people on this call, there's some 200 of you on, please feel free to use the chat to all panelists and attendees. But if you want to ask us a question or want me to ask the panelists a question, the best way is to use the Q&A button. Okay, I think I've talked more than long enough. Although I do want to just very quickly, again, give a shout out to Lisa, who really is making these Zoom conversations happen, as well as to Dina Cooperman of our marketing team, who is helping to get the word out. And to let you all know that you will receive a free month subscription to the Forward for participating in this call, and also that we will be emailing you probably tomorrow with any resources that are mentioned in this call, as well as a video link that you can share with anyone who might be interested. Ben, if you're game, if you're back with us, I know you're probably like breaking a story right now, but I wanted to ask you to kind of situate this conversation for us a little bit in the larger journalism conversation. What have you been seeing? How have you been seeing this pandemic affect news organizations positively, negatively? I mean, again, I talked while you were out of the room about, yes, there's been record readership, but
I've been here all along. I've been listening.
Okay, great. Sorry. But also it's intensified some of the challenges we face. So I hope you can give us like a little bit of a top view of the industry and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a catastrophe for the economy, and news businesses are parts of the economy across a really broad spectrum. Like if you're in the advertising business, big advertising categories are airlines and cruises and auto dealers and all sorts of things that aren't advertising anymore. And I think people are anticipating their advertising will go down, between 25 and 50%. If you're selling subscriptions, you need people to have money to pay for subscriptions. And I think a lot of people anticipate a lot of people kind of looking to cut costs and dropping those. And if you're in the philanthropic world, everybody's in debt. Foundations typically give a percentage, and I'm sure people on this call know better than I do, give typically a percentage of their endowment, and endowments are down. And so I think, there are huge challenges. I think, just across the industry. I think, but the basic effect of that altogether has been to accelerate trends that we were already seeing, which is to say a kind of consolidation around the most successful players. The New York Times is one, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, kind of nobody else in the national newspaper business. And the one bright spot has been subscriptions. But the thing about subscriptions, which are like obviously, I think in the long-term way, the way that a lot of news businesses will survive, is that it's like a slow thing. Like if you think about The Atlantic, they added like 30,000, which is probably the most successful publication in this moment, I think. They added like 30,000 subscriptions last month. And if you do the math on that, that's like something like a $2.5 million or $2 million, maybe $1.5 million annual income. That's still like one great ad deal that fell through. And it's just going to be a really long road for a lot of these companies that depend on advertising.
When you talk about accelerating what was already happening, the other part of what was happening, right, is the search for kind of a new model, right? A new sustainable model.
Yeah.
And do you think, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, what you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things on that front. One is that the most energy right now around new things is around nonprofits. There's the City in New York City. There's a lot of them are kind of replacing metro newspapers, the Texas Tribune, Cal Matters. They're all over the country.
Forward.
The Forward. Well, the Forward is not a new one, but it's a pioneer in the nonprofit model. And obviously, like people say, like nonprofit is a tax designation, does not actually need to, is not a business model. And a lot of them take revenue in a lot of different ways. But I think there is a lot of energy there. There's a new one that started in West Virginia, kind of out of what's left of the Charleston Gazette. And I think there's I think that's where there's a lot of energy, particularly in places where there's a local kind of business community that can fund it. That's not going to be true everywhere. The other thing that's interesting, right, is that, the real underlying issue is that Google and Facebook have swallowed the ad industry that used to go to publications like ours. And there has been a drumbeat for a long time that I think it's still not taken that seriously in this country, that the government should basically take a bunch of that money and hand it back to publishers. The Australian government this week just moved in a really serious way to do that. And I think people will be looking at that model, and it's possible that you'll see in Europe and Australia, and then probably eventually here, some giant new tax on Google and Facebook that transfers money to publishers, which would be a huge shift.
I realized that I failed to mention that Ben's knowledge of the Forward is not just as an expert media columnist, but as an alum. Ben was a Forward intern back in 1998. And I think when you're referring to nonprofit as a model, you're right, it's not a business model, but part of the model there is really about the concept of journalism as public service as opposed to as a commodity. And I want to really talk about that as we get into it. But I want to turn to Sue now to take us a little bit to ground level. You've been editor of the J, I think, for 10 years, right?
Almost 10 years, but worked in Jewish journalism for 30 years.
Wow. So talk to us a little bit about what you're facing right now, how this crisis, how you're covering the crisis, how it's affecting your ability to function, and like how you think, your positioning compared to some of the crises we've seen in other publications.
Right. Well, local Jewish journalism, and Jonathan's going to talk about that right after me, so I won't take from what he's going to talk about. But local Jewish journalism serves its community, right? So we're always balancing between the need to serve our community and to do journalism. When the COVID crisis happened, about 3 weeks before shelter in place was declared in California, we got software that allowed us to work remotely. The timing was so fortuitous. If we had not done that, we would be in a very different situation than we are. But we were able to put out a print as well as a digital publication completely remotely. And it's interesting because that may affect how we go back to work. It will affect the future of journalism. Will publications need the kind of office space that they've been taking up? I mean, there's many things that have yet to be explored. We're doing more work now because of COVID, and our community is turning to us for news, Jewish news, in a way I think that they weren't always for the last generation. We're doing the same trend stories that the secular publications, that the dailies are doing. We're just looking at them from a Jewish perspective, how this is affecting our schools, healthcare workers, families, people who are being laid off, the increase in domestic violence, the increase in isolation. We're seeing a lot more opinion pieces come in, and many more of them spiritually oriented. Rabbis have been writing opinion pieces, and that's not surprising. We're in a crisis, right? No atheists in the foxholes. That is playing out. Ben, you said nonprofit is not a business model, and that is correct. But when we became a 501c3, a federal nonprofit 7 years ago, we did that to save ourselves financially. Our ad revenue, like everyone's, was plummeting. And we've been able in 7 years to really shift the balance. Whereas 7 years ago, about 10% of our revenue came from fundraising. Today, 40 to 45% is coming from fundraising. Our ad revenue slips every year as our fundraising increases. We in San Francisco are fortunate to be in a wealthy Jewish community, to be in a place where Jewish family funds are situated, as well as large donors. And we have benefited from some of those donors as As the Forward benefited from Craig Newmark, so have we. As all the big Jewish family funds, the Goldman funds and the Libitskys and various people who have been able to support us. And I think, we're public servants. I think that Jewish publications, particularly community publications, should exist so long as their communities want them. Now, that's easy for me to say here in San Francisco, but when we look at other Jewish communities that don't have vibrant Jewish publications, places like Indianapolis, Kansas City, Miami, all of South Florida, should we be looking, and some of the questions coming in from your readers are exactly talking about this, should we be looking at a national funding model for local Jewish publications in areas where there are growing and vibrant Jewish communities, but they don't have that publication? I think that's something that's worth discussing.
So I'm going to ask Andres about that in a minute, but before we do that, I'm going to ask Professor Sarna, who is his home office is the living expression of being Professor Sarna, which I love to see on Zoom. I've just shared in the chat his brilliant op-ed that he wrote right before Pesach started about the trouble in Canada and Britain. And Professor Sarna also was leading a task force last fall in Boston that the Federation started about the status of Jewish journalism in the Boston area and the sort of crisis that it found itself in. And so he is deeply concerned about Jewish journalism, like not because it's his livelihood, but because of its importance to the community. And I'd love to hear that perspective. Put this in the context. What has Jewish journalism really meant for our community's big picture over time?
So in many ways, Jewish journalism helped to shape and maintain community. Back in the 1840s, when Jewish journalism gets started, Jews are moving all over in search of opportunity. And the question is, what's going to link them to one another? What's going to inform them? What's going to keep them connected to other Jews? And the great Jewish leader, Isaac Leeser, seeing the new role of the printing press, he establishes a journal, and then Isaac Mayer Wise establishes a journal, and others follow. We have national and local, and this is what robust Jewish community is about. There are disagreements, there are arguments over religious matters, there's news, there's a good deal of Jewish education, and I think we often forget how important the role of Jewish journalism is in shaping an educated Jewish community, but in many ways, the newspaper defines, maintains, promotes community, and then it is the vehicle through which we preserve history. Everybody wanted to know when the coronavirus hit, well, what happened in 1918, the last time there was a pandemic? Well, there's actually no book on the Jewish community in the 1918 Spanish flu, as it was wrongly called. And the only way to find out is to go back to those Jewish newspapers and to look up what happened and how the community responded. And so the newspaper is amazing or the journalism, it doesn't have to be on paper, is amazing in that it shapes community now and it secures our history going forward. And in a lot of ways, if there is not robust Jewish journalism, I'm not sure you'll have robust community. For one thing, people will retreat into their own silos. So yes, on Facebook, I will connect with all the people with whom I agree, but who's going to inform me about those other folks with whom I disagree, but who I ought to know about? That's what good journalism really does. Now, are there all sorts of difficult challenges? And there have been. I wrote a history of Jewish journalism. I can send a PDF if people want it. And there's long been a tension between the role of Jewish journal as a kind of advocate for the Jewish community and the role of the Jewish journal as a purveyor of truth, as a watchdog over the Jewish community. And that's not going to go away. But now we run the risk that in community after community, we will have neither. Now, for a long time, Jewish newspapers were a reasonably good business. They, even small ones, could support themselves because they lived off local advertising. As we've heard, that era is finished. There's no way we're going to bring it back. One of the things I learned in that task force that I had the honor to chair and that Jodi very kindly met with is that you really need today a very different model. If some foundation grants and some advertising and some subscriptions and some contributions and some sponsorship of content and some digital revenue. And then the most interesting of all, the one that I think only a very few Jewish newspapers have done, the Jewish Week in New York, has done it, and that's event revenue, where the newspaper really stages educational public events. Let's bring the cast of Shtisel to town so people can meet them, and that too becomes a source of revenue. And when you put all of those things together, then the newspaper, I think, does, or the journal has a chance at really making it. But I think, like many things, and then we'll finish, we will only realize what we've lost after Jewish journalism dies. And suddenly in London, that's just what's happened. People said, we're not going to have our Jewish newspaper anymore. And instead of dying, we have two people vying to kind of keep it alive. And both of them are talking about how they're going to make it stronger. And I think there's an important lesson there. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in Canada. Because to my mind, if you care about Jewish community, you've got to care about good Jewish journalism.
Andres, I see you nodding, and it's a perfect segue to you, because I know that's something it's really central to how you think about it. So, man, if you can pick up from Professor Sarna's history to talk about how you see this playing out right now, because I think you've been really worried about this decline in Jewish journalism and what it means for our community, right?
Yeah, I've been worried, and Jodi, you and I talked about it before COVID. I think the decline in Jewish journalism is really the decline, the disappearance rather, of the public square in the Jewish community. We don't have a public square. We don't have public square in the United States. There's a great book, I can't remember the title now from the life of me, but it's about the disappearance of places where different people got together. Like people don't
Bowling
go to park.
Alone, I think, right? Bowling
Yeah.
Alone?
Well, no, it's not Bowling Alone. It's a guy who actually analyzes
Naked public square.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
So the idea that we don't have a public square in terms of ideological debates, in terms of civil ideological debate, the very fabric of a public square is a shared understanding of common facts, not interpretations of facts. That's ideology, but at least the substrata of facts is there, and the lack of that public square has terrible implications for the Jewish community. The polarization and the extremism that we see in the Jewish community, both in the left and the right, have to do with the lack of that middle ground when different opinions can be heard, and what Professor Sarna was referring to the self-reinforcing mechanism of, what somebody called narrowcasting instead of broadcasting. You get your Facebook feed that, gives you stuff that you already agree with, and you keep reinforcing your point until it happens that you live in a completely different universe than your neighbor. In the Jewish community, in the U.S. community, we can see that. People that live off Fox News, they literally live in a different reality than people that, watch MSNBC. It's not just that they look at the fact that they interpret it differently. It's a different universe of facts and values. And that's extremely dangerous for the notion of having a community. Now, what's the problem here? In a context of cultural wars and ideological wars, people are very keen to fund pamphlets. People are very keen to fund propaganda. In other words, not all nonprofit journalism is not sustainable. Some outlets are very sustainable and are doing very well. Why? Because a funder says, I want to have this newspaper or this website as my mouthpiece. And a funder will say, I don't want to be a friar to, a sucker to fund something that is going to publish stuff that I disagree with. And yet, that's what is needed. We need to realize that the same way a community needs summer camps and day schools and JCCs, it needs a media ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean that we have just one newspaper. As Professor Sarna was saying, in the golden age of Jewish American journalism, you had very different outlets and they were fighting each other, but there was that space of neutral ground, of community journalism that actually existed. So I think that two things need to happen for that to change. And by the way, I saw the problem, but I guilty as everybody else. I said in my speech to the JFN members, to the funders, what were the 4 communal systems that needed to be saved, quote unquote, during the crisis? And I said JCCs, camps, day schools, and human service organizations, and I didn't mention media. So there is a mental change in all of us to realize how important media is as a community system that needs to be built and upheld. And the second is to realize that for media to fulfill its community building role, you will need to fund stuff that you disagree with. And that's an enormous shift for funders to make, one that I hope we can send the message across.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we talked about public service journalism, and the other piece of this, and we see this, we're going to get to some of your questions that are asking about this, but it's public service journalism and it's independent journalism that I think is so critical to our community. Ben, I want to go back to you as someone who's now spent most of your career, obviously, in the as I did, in the mainstream non-Jewish press. I wonder if you can help.
Well, not exactly non-Jewish, but
that's true, right?
We know Jews control the media, so.
I wonder if you can take us back and give us a little bit of context or kind of talk a little bit about how the things that we're talking about, that Andres and Jonathan particularly were talking about, how they are similar or different to what the secular or mainstream press is facing, and how you see the idea of Jewish journalism in the broader body of community journalism.
Okay, I think a couple of things. Let's see. One is that, there's a lot that's similar. For instance, this notion that event revenue and events are this, we're about to be this huge plank of the business. But have all been shut down and are now this, for the, I think, foreseeable future, not going to be a big plank of the business. Because I think that, as the economy starts to come back, it's going to be a while before let's squeeze everybody in a room and make them pay for it is going to work. But I think what Andres said about people starting to think about journalism differently, and in a way think about it like as a public utility that a community needs, like water or electricity, really is new. And for philanthropists to see it as like an appropriate outlet for philanthropic giving, like that's just new. I mean, I think if you were, you know, this isn't specifically Jewish, but if you were like a rich guy in Indianapolis 30 years ago, you would never give money to journalism because the Pulliam family who owned the paper were printing money. And I think for the sort of traditional donors to it's sort of a realization that this stuff isn't going to exist in the same way the ballet won't exist if there isn't philanthropy for it, is a real shift. And I think something that, you know, I think actually the reaction to Donald Trump really brought home to people how important journalism was. And I think that's been just like a huge change in the sort of way foundations, you know, and we're not talking about like the kind of handful of foundations who are focused on media, but just general, you know, civic-minded individuals and foundations think about journalism in a totally different way that I think is in the United States permanent and a pretty important shift. I think, you know, community and sort of ethnic and media are in this have for a long time been in a more difficult place. I think partly because social media replaces more of what they do than it does what sort of a wire service does. I mean, social media does connect people and bring them together and allow them to share, you know, conversations and traditions and all those things, you know, in a way that it doesn't tell you. Well, it is pretty good for telling you what oil prices are too. But I think, I do think that, you know, social media adds a lot to these cultural conversations and to the Jewish conversation. I think like the challenge in a way is not to sort of try to replace or compete with social media, but figure out what it is that isn't social media that we do.
But I want to pick up on that and ask all of you about this thing about the what Andres was talking about the polarization and this question of like, is there a consensus? Is there a public square? How come, you know, these strong ideological publications within the Jewish sphere as well as in the secular press have done better and better? Our social media is filter bubbled. You know, I had this funny time experience. As many of you know, I was the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times starting in 2012. When I went there in 2012, I was like, this covering this conflict is totally different than anything else. Nobody can agree on axiomatic facts. People's perception of the news is totally wrapped up in their identity, and advocates are attacking the media in terms of to try to undermine them rather than acting, you know, as advocates in the conflict itself. I've never seen this with anything else I've covered, not politics, not abortion, not immigration. I came home on January 2nd, 2016. And of course, now everything is like that. The coverage of everything is now exactly like that. Although I still think it's kind of worse in the Jewish community in terms of this idea that we don't have there doesn't seem to be much respect for this idea of a public square, a publication where people would engage with opinions that challenge them and seek independent reporting that would kind of set the table and be clear about here are the facts. Sue, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about this question of what you see as, you know, the lack of consensus in the Jewish community, and how does a publication serve a community that doesn't have consensus?
Well, I think you covered a lot of it, but yes, indeed, I was picking up on what Andres said, you know, the cry for a more moderate middle ground. For more than a generation, there hasn't been that kind of national consensus, national Jewish consensus, which was around Israel and around the Holocaust, right? So that hasn't existed really for a generation. In San Francisco, we have extreme left and right within our Jewish community, not outside the Jewish community. And it is difficult to find a middle ground, and it's not enough just to print opposing viewpoints and pretend that you have served that middle ground. We, you know, look, our consensus now is we oppose anti-Semitism. And for the last few years, anti-Semitic acts as well as attitudes have been on the increase in this country. But you don't find the strength of a community in what opposes it. You know, that can keep us together temporarily, but really finding what is the future of Jewish identity? What is the future of Jewish institutions? What does it mean to have a Jewish education in the 21st century? These are the issues that all Jewish media should be exploring, and the good ones are. That's how you build identity.
Can,
Go ahead,
can I?
Andres.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a really important point. The question I think that we need to grapple with, especially for funders, and I'm talking about funders because is the public I know best, is what is the role of Jewish journalism in today's world? And many funders have a worldview, especially in relation to Israel anti-Semitism and stuff like that they say, we're at war. And war is not the time for nuanced arguments and niceties of civil debate. A war is a time to defend yourself and attack. They see the role of Jewish journalism as advocacy. And that colors how they understand it. And that's why they get so upset when somebody will publish things that are in favor of Israel and against Israel. And they would say, well, don't publish that because we're at war. Don't feed our enemies these arguments. Now, I think that's a legitimate point of view, but it misses the point of the role that media can play to build community. And in a community, the best, I mean, you don't choose who's in your community. What you do is you build trust inside your community, and trust defines the community. So I think we need to help funders realize that there is a role that goes beyond advocacy, beyond broadcasting to generating dialogue. And it's also, and it's a model that we don't really know how to send that message along, but I think it's the key for what we're trying to do. And in that, we're different than secular news outlets. Now, I don't know if the New York Times seeks to build a sense of an American community or a New York community, whereas a Jewish newspaper has that goal.
Yeah, what about that, Ben? What do you, and someone is, Ken Toltz is asking in the Q&A a little bit of like, why does Ben even care about this topic? And I wonder if you could jump in on both the question of, like on what you see, like, is Jewish journalism important now that you've graduated onto the?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I've never really thought about why I care. I definitely do.
Seriously, you read the Forward. You're a member of our Forward Association.
Yeah, I mean, and I read, Tablet and Jewish Currents and everything else. Let's see. I think I'm going to dodge that question. I don't know, because I'm a member of the community, so I care about it, so I read it and care about it. I think is actually the answer. I do think that, like, I'm not sure. I think that, if you look at the history of the Forward, it was much more like the ideological sort of combat-driven, ready outlets of this era than it was like these metro newspapers from the middle of the century that were all things to all people and often quite boring, and like or could get away with being boring because they were monopolies. And I do think this is a challenge for a lot of publications now that depend, that have funders who don't want controversy, that the energy is in controversy and people do want, then the way you build community is by taking a side in these incredibly high stakes fights. And like, I think there's a version of the Forward that is just like all in for Bernie Sanders in its socialist tradition, right? Which I am sure has donors like walking away really rapidly. But I think that it's hard to, I think the big challenge for the Times now is that like it's torn between being the voice of the resistance and being, which it doesn't want to be, that's not the DNA of the Salzburgers, but it's what a lot of its audience wants it to be.
Right.
And I think these are tricky choices.
Yeah, I definitely feel, having spent the bulk of my career in mainstream journalism, I spent 21 years at the Times and just started at the Forward about 7 months ago. Many of the challenges are the same. Everybody wants you to be some reflection of themselves, but there is also, I think, a deep respect for independent, truth-seeking reporting. And I mean, the Times has really seen an outpouring of that over the last few years, with like now 5 million people paying for that.
But is it for independent, truth-seeking reporting, or is it for independent, truth-seeking reporting that is negative about Donald Trump?
It's a good question. And I think, you know, it's funny because we've been having a lot of internal debates at the Forward about this question of, you know, what's our ideology? And I, you know, really believe, for me, our ideology is the ideology of inquiry. That's the news organization we want to be. But I think the question of what audiences want, and whether audiences really want that and really respect that in the way that Jonathan and Andres are talking about the importance of it for our community is I think still a little bit of an open question.
So let me jump in and give it a kind of a Jewish perspective for a moment. My late father was always, who was a Bible scholar, was a great fan of the model of the rabbinic Bible. In the middle is the Torah, the truth, and around it are commentators. And if you read those commentators, they attack one another. Occasionally one says the other's words should be burned, and they're all there around the text. And that model, yeah, there have to be some things that we agree upon, and I think opposing anti-Semitism, promoting Jewish education, promoting certain values and ideas, absolutely. But the notion that it's well within our tradition to have what the rabbis called machloket, to have disputation, that is our tradition. And this fear of disputation is not one that I think anyone deeply knowledgeable about Jewish life and history would recognize. I do think there are some Jewish newspapers that have tried hard, and I think we can look at them. It's wonderful that the Forward now espouses that idea. It's going to be a shift in the ideology of the Forward, has been observed. I think the Times of Israel was very much created around that idea, and it's very important to watch that experiment, which is full of interesting things. Even the Jewish Week was a very important experiment in New York around that idea, and not sufficiently funded, but very important to watch. And yet there are other newspapers, and we interviewed some, that really feel our job is to make the Jewish community feel good. I won't print, one editor said, something that someone will read on Friday night and be upset, disturbed, and so on. That's not a sense of journalism that I agree with. It's not new. Stephen Wise used to say the Jewish weeklies, which he spelled W-E-A, A-L-I-E-S, because he thought so many of them were weak in that way. But I think we need to uphold high-level journalism and make the point that is our tradition. The disputation is our tradition, and we shouldn't be afraid of articulating that.
Jonathan, I totally love that, and particularly that you brought Nachum Sarna into the conversation. I'm sure my parents, who I think are on, will particularly appreciate that too. I want to turn to some of these great questions we're getting from the audience, and I know everyone has a lot to say. Lonnie Goldsmith asked a question that there's like 5 versions of this question, but I'm going to use Lonnie's, which is, how do you sell people, particularly donors, on the idea that it's important to write stories that may shine an unwelcome light on something that's going on in the community? I'm going to ask you, Andres, this. There have been other versions of this question you may have seen in the chat.
Yeah.
How do you cover, and Sue, you can follow Andres, how do you cover something that is about somebody who's giving you money, a donor? How can we navigate the balance between covering important institutions that may also fund our journalism?
Right, and it's a real issue, and the Jewish Week confronted that when they reported a non-flattering story about a donor of theirs, and they lost donors because of that. Not just that particular person, but others that were upset. I think that before I got straight to the question, I think that we need to separate 2 different questions here. One is, what is the right business model for Jewish communal media, for Jewish journalism? That is one question that needs to be answered by experts in the field, people that understand this type of business model, studying others. The other one is, what is the role of Jewish journalism in the community? And we should look at them separately, because we may choose a role based on the business model that works rather than the other way around. We need to say, okay, what is that we want journalism to do? And then let's look at the business model that does that, rather than say, okay, we need to sell advertising, therefore we are beholden to our advertising. I think that it goes to the point of what a healthy community needs. A healthy community needs a media that does shine a light on things that don't work, and people need to be willing to be outvoted or to read things that are not flattering, and it takes a lot of greatness. It's not easy. It's really not easy. But I think that if you understand that it's important to have a sort of a ProPublica of the Jewish community, because the Jewish community, after all, is a multi-billion-dollar, ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of independent oversight, right? So, and it's funds on public funds and on donor funds. So, those things are important for the community, and donors need to understand that they're important for the communities. And now, donors want to do the right thing. Funders want to do the right thing. I think it's more up to us, to the people that can craft this message, to make the case about why this is important. And we have, a lot of stories about how media shining a light on unflattering realities of the Jewish community really produce amazing change. Think from anything from, sexual abuse cases in the ultra-Orthodox community to, issues of mismanagement in major Jewish organizations. And the community is stronger because of that, not weaker. So if people understand that, they're going to be more willing to support it.
Sue, can you talk about, maybe from a real world experience, of what happens when you write something critical about a donor?
Well, it starts before you write something critical about the donor, and there's really not a difference between answering to a donor and answering to a major advertiser, right? I mean, we get money, we get grants from our local federation, and local Jewish organizations are major advertisers. So we have to answer to both of them. And look, there was a story when one of our major donors was brought up on charges of sexual harassment. We covered the case. You have to do it in a non-sensational way. We have a local Jewish nursing home where a staff member has contracted COVID since they've started accepting recovering COVID patients from the hospitals, which was a state order. We talk to the Jewish senior home ahead of time and emphasize, again, it's not sensational. They're not trying to hurt their people. They're trying to keep their people alive and still follow the law. So we're always in a balancing act, just as the dailies are with their big advertisers. It's not something that Jewish journalism has invented, right? We're not beholden to them.
I do think that there's, for me, there's a little bit of a difference in the sense that, and it relates to how the whole model is changing because of digital. Advertisers were when you talk about an advertiser buying an ad in a paper or on a website, it's like they're just using that platform to get their message to the same reader. They're buying the audience, and that's different from investing in the idea of journalism as a public good or as believing in the mission of the thing. And I think what Andres, for me, I mean, a lot of people asked why I left the New York Times. I had a pretty good gig going there, why I would leave there, the most successful journalism organization in the country, to try to reinvent the forward. And it really was about what Andres talked about I really believe the Jewish community, and Ben also talked about it, I really believe the Jewish community deserves serious journalism, accountability journalism, independent journalism, and a broad kind of provocative opinion section with engaging debate. And the investors that we want to support the Forward are the people who believe in those things. It's not people who want to buy space in the Forward to put their point across. I mean, we have sponsored content. You can buy an ad in the Forward, or I'm sure in the J, and I'm sure in many other places, to sell your point. And there's a role for that. But this idea of kind of nonprofit journalism and kind of foundation support, and I saw that Craig Newmark just posted in the chat, and he is, of course, one of the most important benefactors, not only of us and the J, but also of the Markup, another independent, investigative, new nonprofit journalism organization. You know, what we want is people who believe in that thing and want that thing, whatever it turns up, not because it's going to make them look good. And I suppose the funders who are going to believe in that are funders who are pretty secure about what they're doing and not worried about independent coverage of what they're doing. I'll leave that. If anyone wants to comment on that, I'm going to then grab us some more questions.
And there are people in the Jewish community who do believe in it and who have supported it. I come back to the Times of Israel, which has basically been supported on that basis. I definitely think there is room for both. It's not an either or, and there have long been both. I mean, the New York Times, in a sense, was originally created in opposition to all of those party newspapers that were so well known in New York, where every editor was partisan, and that's why it was going to publish all the news that's fit to print and was not just going to be a party journal. That's evolved over time, but this tension is a healthy tension, and I think our problem in the Jewish community today, and I think Andres pointed out well, there are plenty of people who want to support the advocacy, which has existed for a long time, but tragically, we have not taught a new generation of donors to appreciate the value of truth-centered journalism, the traditional journalism as watchdog, and the idea that a journal is the place where multiple perspectives are put forth.
I would like to, sorry. No, go ahead.
We're all jumping in.
I was just going to try to surface some more questions. You made a joke before, Ben, about you know, some of the mainstream media organizations being also Jewish organizations. And Jonathan Levine is asking, are there particular problems for Jewish media focusing on communities where mainstream media includes a significant amount of Jewish content, like perhaps our beloved New York Times?
Yeah, I mean, you know, maybe this is like a diminishing problem though. Like when I was running BuzzFeed, I definitely like looked around the newsrooms like, oh my God, this is so goyish. And like, I think that like the generation of Jews who were all over media is sort of like, I think if you look at the sort of second and third tiers at most news organizations, you see a lot of Catholics and a lot of Black people and some Mormons, and it's like a lot of Asian Americans. Like it's a really like it's a different mix, and that maybe it's good for Jewish journalism actually that you won't have New York Times editors who are like obsessed with the controversy at Ramaz the way you used to.
Go ahead, Andres.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I mean, we shouldn't. I mean, it's true that media has all these problems and the community has all this problem with media, but I think that, and I hate to use this trite phrase, but this crisis presents us with a great opportunity on to rethinking community systems. People are realizing that the day after, with all the quarantines is lifted and the vaccine is out there, the community will need to look different. In other words, you know, JCCs will operate different, and day schools will operate different, and that will happen in all of North America. I mean, who is going to be willing to pay $70,000 tuition for college when you just prove that you can do it online much cheaper? And okay, it's not the same as being in a campus, but it's good enough. So things are going to change, and entire systems are going to change. So I think, you know, I would focus less on why it hasn't been working well. I would say this: we have an opportunity now, precisely because of this crisis, to reinvent and reimagine a media ecosystem. And I think that that's a very exciting exercise for practitioners, for community leaders, and for donors.
Andres, I could not possibly agree more, and that's part of what we're doing here, like in the Zoom, like let's do this, you know, and
Right.
and we are every day in our editorial meetings really talking about how do we serve the community in this moment, and what does the community most need, and what's our role versus some of these other organizations. I want to just I want to try to get as many of these questions out before the end of our time, which is like 5 minutes. Paul Massell, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks a really straightforward question. How much would a wealthy person have to donate to fund a good neutral Jewish newspaper in some big city that lacks one now? It can't be that much, he says, and gives as an example, only a fraction of what Bloomberg spent on his campaign. Right. Now, of course, a fraction of what Bloomberg spent on his campaign is that much, but I want to ask Sue Fishkoff, who runs a Jewish newspaper in a big city. Yeah, how much would it cost to go create a good Jewish newspaper in a city? Can you throw out is it $1 million profit? $1 million a year? Is that going to buy us a good Jewish newspaper?
You can have a Jewish publication like they have in Seattle now, which is a one-woman operation, right, run by Emily El-Hadef, and pay one good journalist's salary to do a digital new Jewish community publication from home. That's bottom line. And for a city that doesn't have anything, that's a good beginning. Sure, our budget is more than $1 million a year, but we have 20 staff members. So it's a different proposition. You get what you pay for, but as long as you get a smart person doing that journalism, it's important. And I also wanted to pick up on.
Yeah, I want you to, I was going to just tee you up a little bit, but just, you know, Ben was talking about what he saw at BuzzFeed, which was sort of the next generation of millennial digital journalists. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see Jewish journalism moving forward to that next generation.
Right. Well, in the last year, I've hired 3 people in their 20s as journalists. And it kind of, you know, it amazes me that young people want to go into Jewish journalism. But people want something that is satisfying, that's emotionally satisfying, spiritually satisfying. They want to feel that they're making a difference. So just as in any of the alternative media, the Jewish media is a niche media where you can feel that you do make a difference. And I wanted to get back to something that Jonathan said, which is the importance of Jewish journalism as chronicling our history. And one way that we at J, in a very limited way, have gone into some of the local Jewish schools with our one digitized year, 1967, and talked to and showed the students in those Jewish schools, look, in 1967, our publication was arguing about intermarriage, and homosexuality wasn't even on the radar yet. How is that different than your community today? And the kids are fascinated by that, and that gives them a sense of who they are today as part of a long tradition. And hey, in 1904, people were arguing about the next generation of Jews just doesn't care, right? And look, here we are 120 years later. So Jodi, when you put up, here's the Forward's digital archives from 1918 flu, I love that. And I'm also so jealous of it because we at J go back to 1895 and we're not digitized at all.
But
so that's a part of community history.
A lot of Jewish newspapers are. And educators have not sufficiently understood how Jewish newspapers can be used as a very exciting educational tool. And there's a lot of work to be done there. Other questions?
We have only a couple minutes left, and I know people are already leaving the chat, and you all have to go. As usual with any gathering of smart Jews, we could go for a number of more hours. I really want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to give you each kind of a last word, but I just want to thank again Lisa Lepson and Dina Cooperman for all the work they did to get us here, and all of you for joining us. We have a lot of really smart and thoughtful people on the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of your questions. We will circulate not only the video of this program, but also some of the links and resources that were mentioned. We'll send you all an email for that. We are signing you up for a free month subscription to the Forward, and we really do appreciate your support, your time, your readership in this moment. And let's just go, let's jump in. Everybody, like, give me your last kind of sum up word. What's the takeaway you want our viewers to leave today with? Andres, you want to start?
Yeah, just first of all, I've been answering some questions, typing them in the Q&A.
Oh, good.
So those that asking can check there. I think that, not to be repetitive, I think that, we all need to work together to make sure that the community at large, funders, practitioners, Jews in the street, understand how important it is to have an independent media that work with transparency and with intellectual honesty. And I think that, from JFN perspective, we're going to be convening funders to talk about this more in depth. But I think that every community leader, every community actor should include media and the future of media as part of their conversations.
All media is changing. Jewish journalism is changing to serve as the community changes. That's what I have to say.
I would say that this very
Dog bombing
is historic in the sense that we're paying attention to a subject that has not much been on the community's agenda. And as Andre pointed out, even in his own work, it's new that this is seen as important as the other issues we've talked about. It has to find a place on the community's agenda, or we won't have a community.
Ben?
I just wanted to pick up on something Sue said, which was, I do think that the technology for running, and when you think about like a local Jewish publication, there's just no world where there are going to be lots of print newspapers in medium-sized cities starting up, but the technology for running a small website, a Substack newsletter, has gotten a lot better. And a person with a network of freelancers can, do a lot of damage, can do something that's really interesting and cool and independent of philanthropy, which is powerful in its own way. And I do think that that's a place where just the tech for small subscription publications has gone from something where you'd have to hire a tech person to something where you'd pay $20 a month. And that's a huge change. And so I think that's kind of exciting.
I mean, that's part of I think it's part of this larger trend that we're seeing, right, which has pros and cons, but it's like there's been a democratization of our industry where anyone can publish anything and people can find it and read it and engage with it. And a lot of, sometimes that works really negatively in terms of hate speech or whatever, but other times it really makes quality rise. And I think, we see that all the time where we publish great things and they get a lot of readers. And there's something very rewarding and kind of trust confidence building for me about that. And yeah, the idea of someone in Seattle like doing it up from her home is inspiring. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We have another Zoom coming up next week on the Unorthodox. Hope you'll join us for that. And good luck with all of your other Zoom versations, Zoom meetings, Zoom entertainment. And I hope you have a good Wednesday. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're all good. Thank you, guys. Ben, what's your dog's name?
Thank you, Jodi. That was.
Oh, we still have people on. But Ben, what's your dog's name anyway? You're muted.
Her name is Jazz.
Is she loving having you home the way that all the dogs of America?
Oh my God, the dogs are having the best time.
Did you see the meme of like, buy a dog, buy a cat, and pretty funny.
So good.
All right. Thanks,
you Jodi.
so much. I so appreciate you doing this. Talk soon.